Thank you, Sarah, and thank you again all for being here this evening. Oh, yes, we would be remiss if we didn't point out that we have a brand new magazine issue,
Yes.
More Than a Pet, which is based on last year's Café series about the long-term, very important relationship between canines. I'm looking right at my good friend Dusty Whiting over here because we share special affections, as many of you do, for canines. So here it is. And so we encourage you to find ways to put this into your possession and enjoy it.
If you want to buy it tonight, if you haven't received it, come to me after the talk. I have a way for you to buy it. So find me after. Thank you.
Thanks again, Sarah. So yes, John Welch. I'm the Vice President for Collaboration and Preservation here at Archaeology Southwest. And we are very pleased to welcome University of Arizona Emeritus Professor of Geosciences and Anthropology, Vance T. Holliday, as our speaker and discussant this evening. I'm reading this introduction for a couple of reasons. First, Vance arrived at the U of A as I was departing, and we just don't know each other very well. So I seized the opportunity to do a bit of research and learn more about his distinguished career. I will say he's been a terrific source of advice and encouragement for the forensic sedimentology program that we run here at Archaeology Southwest in collaboration with the SaveHistory.org program that Shannon Cowell runs, Dusty Whiting's been affiliated with, and others have really contributed to, but Vance has been a big help there. And then second, I wanted to say that I'm unfortunately not capable enough to memorize more than 150 words or creative enough to write a cool corrido or a set of spiffy rhyming couplets that might help with my memory. So we're about to find out whether I am clever enough to pull off a trails trope in giving Vance his due as our honored guest and benefactor. Vance Holliday's career has followed actual, literal, and intellectual trails across landscapes and into deep time. The trail began in the quiet plains of Texas, where Vance set foot on the path that would wind through the layered histories of the American Southwest and the Great Plains. His early fascination with landscapes and the traces of ancient life led him toward geology, following a compass that would later guide his steps into archaeology. As his trail twisted and steepened, Vance's route merged these two terrains, earth science and human history. At the U of A, Professor Holliday became a leading figure in geoarchaeology, a discipline that reads soils and sediments as deeply as artifacts. Like a traveler pausing at each overlook and switchback, he examines the ground, or he has examined the ground beneath Clovis and Folsom Paleo-Indian sites, boosting our knowledge of how climate, erosion, and time have intertwined with the movement and survival of indigenous ancestors. His pioneering work at the Lubbock Lake and Mockingbird Gap sites have refined ways that archaeologists interpret stratigraphy and site formation processes, demonstrating that the land itself is the first and most enduring archive and curator of the vast material record of the human experience. Along this trail, Holliday left well-marked cairns for others to follow. His book, Stratigraphy and Paleoenvironments of the Late Quaternary Valley Fills on the Southern Plains, High Plains, and later Soils and Archaeological Research, remain essential guides for generations of researchers. Through dozens of scholarly publications, leadership roles, and mentorships, including that of our dear friend, Chris Rose, he has helped map the terrain linking environmental change and human adaptation across millennia. Vance is here, of course, to lead us on a hike into the deep time of human travel through the unique trailscape of the White Sands. Holliday's trail embodies commitments to understanding the human past by walking the land as a geologist and as a time traveler, attentive to both stones and stories. The marks he has left are not just footprints, but trail guides for future archaeologists to follow into the Earth's memory, one layer at a time. Thanks so much again to all of you, and of course to Vance for making the trek. Over to you, good sir.
Thanks, John. Wow. I might as well just go home after that. I'm not going to be able to top it. I will say, since we're all here at Archaeology Southwest, and all of you have some interest, if not a lot of interest in archaeology, I started in archaeology, and it was digging up dirt in archaeology, which got me interested in geology. So, and then sort of came full circle in doing both now. Anyway, thank you very much for being here. This is such a spectacular place. Yeah, I've been a fan of this organization since we arrived in 2002. My wife is an archaeologist as well, so it's always nice to come over and see the folks here. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about several related things. Some of you know something about the track story at White Sands. That initial discovery was in January of 2020, just before COVID hit. And then the initial story was published in 2021. And there's been some controversy that I'm going to talk about that, in a sense, provided some testable hypotheses. And so I had an opportunity to further explore the dating of the tracks, independent of the work on the tracks themselves. So I'm gonna do a little travelogue through time, my own time working out in the area, in the White Sands area. So most of you will have some familiarity with the basic chronology, artifact chronology, cultural chronology, subsistence stories for the well-expressed archaeological assemblages that we have in the Southwest and on the Great Plains. And Clovis, the earliest well-established artifact assemblage and culture, for lack of a better term, which is pretty much continent-wide. But the question has been, ever since Clovis was recognized, was there anything older than Clovis? And as most of you are probably well aware, this has been quite a debate for, well, it's probably gone on for almost 100 years. Well, yeah, about that. So who came before? Did anyone come before? And if so, who? I'm going to talk about one site in New Mexico that has, I think, a really good story of a very early, for North America, very early occupation on the continent. So there are a number of sites that have been proposed as older than Clovis, older than about 13,000 years. They're more than I have on this map, but that's a smattering of some of the better known ones. Of course, Monteverde in South America is well known. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, Paisley Caves in Oregon, a couple of others. And then White Sands is where the yellow Clovis point is in southern New Mexico. And that's where we're going to go. Now, in the late Pleistocene, in the last ice age, there were a number of lakes, paleo lakes, scattered through the Southwest. There were over 100 in the Great Basin. Up in Nevada and parts of California, there were over 100 lakes in the basins out there. Here in the Southwest, there were something like a dozen. I indicated some of the better knowns. Wilcox and Benson, that was a paleo lake during the Ice Age. There was a big one east of Albuquerque, Estancia. Where I've been working on the White Sands Missile Range and in the National Park, there are two paleo lakes, Otero in the south and Trinity. Guess where that name comes from? It's about 5 miles from the lake. And we're going to go and spend our time down around Paleo Lake Otero. And that's on both the Missile Range and in the White Sands National Park. Okay. Here is Google Earth imagery, Las Cruces down here, the Rio Grande. The Tularosa Basin is just on the other side of the Organ Mountains and the San Andres Mountains. Some of you probably been to the park, White Sands Park, big white blob that shows up quite well on the satellite imagery in the Tularosa Basin. And it actually is, it sort of overwhelms the imagery because there's a lot more subtlety to what's going on in the park. And this geologic map, in this light green blue here, where it says alkali flat, the color is more or less an indication of the Paleo Lake Otero. Now that was in existence during and after the last ice age. And it's key to this story. It started drying out, not exactly clear when, about 10,000 years ago, maybe a little older. And when it did, wind started to scour the old lake floor, and most of the lake sediment was gypsum. That sediment was blown out of the basin here and piled up here as the White Sands Dune. It's the largest gypsum dune field in the world. It's a huge pile of gypsum sand. And then left behind is what's now called alkali flat. That's where the old lake beds were scoured away. And a really critical part of the story is that erosion left an escarpment all along the east side of the Paleo Lake. And that's where we've been working. That's where the human tracks were found eroding out along this escarpment. And that's where the dating story I'm going to talk about is also exposed. That's the critical thing, is that the wind erosion over time has exposed this story. And then we've added to it with a few trenches and whatever it takes. On the missile range, most of the trenching was on the missile range, not in the park. Okay. Now, I was drawn to the area, way back. I never thought I'd get to work on the park or the missile range, but we did. It's a whole other story. All sorts of Paleo-Indian archaeological remains. This right here is all Folsom, but you name it, and it's out there. Clovis is pretty rare, but otherwise, there's just an amazing assemblage of Paleo-Indian sites, and that's been an interest of mine, as John was saying, is understanding how those people fit on the landscape of 13,000, 12,000 years ago. Now, there are also tracks of Ice Age megafauna, absolutely spectacular. That alone is an amazing story, and that's part of the reason why the park went from a monument, a national monument, to becoming a national park. Because now they have two stories, the fauna, the Pleistocene fauna, and the White Sands. And these photographs on the right are mammoth tracks. These are about 30,000 years old. You can see them going off into the distance. These are tracks of a giant ground sloth. There's camel, direwolf. There's another one I'm forgetting. Anyhow, it's amazing. There are thousands of these tracks all over. They can be dated using radiocarbon. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, and a few other methods, because here and there they're found buried. Now, there are also human tracks out there. I've got to remember to mention this. What you just saw is exposed on the old lake floor that's been eroded, okay? So the wind is blowing the sediment away and it exposes tracks. And human tracks, sometimes human tracks near the megafauna tracks. The problem has been, we know the megafauna, the mammoth, for example, went away 13,000 years ago. People, we're still here, right? We could go out there next week or whenever it rains and leave tracks. The issue with the tracks they were finding, even the ones near the mammoth tracks, is figuring out how old those human tracks are. Are they related? Are they linked in time to the mammoth and the direwolf and all the others? So that was an issue for a while. You've got to find, we were telling the park people, you've got to find these tracks in a buried, stratified context where we can do some dating, okay? Well, slowly but surely they got there. The first thing that happened was proof that the tracks, the megafauna tracks, are associated with humans. This was the first one I saw that got my attention. So that's a photographic imagery, and then this is a map. A mammoth came walking along. Well, people came walking along, and then mammoth. And what happened is, those are human footprints that were squished by the weight of the track. And right here, a mammoth track buried the footprint. Classic cross-cutting relationship, boom. There you've got humans that are at least as old as the youngest mammoth, okay? And a few other finds similar to that. Some long tracks too. Some of you may have heard the story. There's a track probably created by a woman. It's about 800 meters long. And every now and then you see the tracks of an infant along with it. So the argument is, and if you have kids, you know it's probably true or been around kids, somebody was carrying a kid, set it down, they walked, kid wanted to be picked it up, and you can see that story. We don't know how old that is, but it's old, right? And it's a really cool, like, snapshot, moment of time story that came out. So then the buried tracks finally appeared. So right in this area along the escarpment right here. So we're gonna go down on the ground. You can see the dunes, the dune field. The White Sands Dunes crosses the park and the missile range. And then where we've been doing our work is been right on the edge of the escarpment. Again, the imagery gets sort of blinded. Everything is so white. But this is the edge of the old lake basin, and the erosion is happening here, dumping the sand down there, and the dunes are moving that way. Also, I'll draw your attention to Lost Draw. That comes off the the Sacramento Mountains, east of Alamogordo, flows across the flats and gets buried by the dune, hence Lost Draw. That's an important part of the story that I'll refer back to in a minute. So, this is Alkali Flat, the erosion part of the story. It looks flat, but actually this is part of the escarpment. Down by the trucks, you'll see, if you can see, there's a fence behind the trucks below the skyline. And if you follow that fence line, here, it's above the skyline. So that's the escarpment, this very low escarpment, and that's where the story is preserved. The geologic story I'm going to talk about is right over here. The darker gray colors are old lake beds being exposed. The human tracks are down on the other side of the fence. In this escarpment, now you'll notice the little ledges. There are dozens and dozens of little ledges. Those are stream deposits coming out of, we think, the end of Lost Draw. So flowing out of the mountains across the flats into the old Paleo Lake, into Paleo Lake Otero. And now those stream deposits are being exposed by wind. And the human tracks that led to the discovery are right here on this brown layer. It's muds. And that discovery was when they realized we've got a chance to date the tracks. We're going to expose them. So they started excavating and peeling away those layers. They could see them here, just they discovered them on the surface like I was showing you some of the other photos. But here they could excavate, and lo and behold, they found more tracks. And so that's what led to the initial discovery in 2020. Those are the discovery tracks right there. And they peeled back the layers and found more. So this is the initial find, as I show in the diagram there, tracks on the old riverbeds. And so they had to document them now buried so they could make a case, okay, these are Ice Age tracks. And that's exactly what happened. They started peeling the layers. You could see the stream deposits there, and they show in the trench. And lo and behold, there were multiple tracks, at least 8 levels of tracks buried in those deposits. It was, I remember being out there. I was having back problems when they were doing the excavations and school was starting, so I couldn't make it out there. But we were out there the day COVID closed everything down. Spring break. I took some students out, and it was a beautiful day. And that was about the only really nice day of that whole spring. Seriously, it was gorgeous, it was quiet, and anyway, and all hell was breaking loose. So yeah, and then you can see the human tracks there. Those are some of the ones that were excavated. You can see those right there just coming up by the water. Okay, so how old are the tracks? Well, there are several ways you can date the tracks using carbon-14 that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. What they focused on were these rupia seeds. It's also called ditch grass. It's an aquatic plant. This is Jeff Pagatti with the U.S. Geological Survey in Denver. He did his PhD here, so there's another U of A connection in the Geosciences department. And they focused their dating on the rupia because they were finding beds of rupia in with the stream deposits and some lake deposits. And that was the initial part of the dating, was the rupia. So this is the stratigraphy, and I don't know how well this shows up in the back, but the dating is like 22.6 thousand years, 22.5, 21.7, and in orange or red, those are the trackways that they found by excavating. So those dates are bracketing the tracks, the human tracks. And that was the initial story, is 20,000, 21,000, 22,000-year-old tracks. That's right in the middle of the last ice age. Okay, this is sort of the summary, the initial summary. TH is track horizon, so you can see TH1 through TH8. Right in here is where most of the dating was, so almost 23,000 to 21,000. Total, you don't need to do the math. It's about a total of 50 individual prints were discovered through that section as of 2021. There's actually more now. There's been some more work, but that hasn't been reported yet. And they did some reconstructions of estimated size of the individual humans, maybe how old they were in terms of the age of the people, not in geologic time. We have those numbers there. So why such a popular place? I mean, that's a lot going on. You saw the trench. We're not talking about a lot of space like this, less than this, maybe twice as long as this, half as wide, and maybe an excavation area about this. And there are people going back and forth on this floodplain. This is a real general idea of what we think was going on. There's Lost Draw feeding into the Paleo Lake. A kind of a delta, maybe. It's not really a delta or a fan, but water is coming in and then being dumped out on the lake shore, and people and animals are crisscrossing it. Oh, and fresh water. That's why people were probably there. Most of the lake is probably pretty bad. All that gypsum used to be in the lake. That's pretty bad water. But there's fresh water, there's animals, obviously, probably all kinds of plants. So a lot of good reasons to come out there. And you've got fresh water when you're way out in the middle of this basin. Okay, and then a hypothetical reconstruction of what it looked like with probably a whole series of streams coming off the mountains, a lot of deltas overlapping, people, animals running around out there. WHSA, that's our site number. I probably forgot to mention that. That's the abbreviation for the park, WHSA, White Sands, and locality 2. That's the name of the site. Okay, now, those tracks coincide with the last ice age. And during the ice maximum, about 21,000, 22,000 years old, it's the same as the tracks. North America is covered by glacial ice from coast to coast. Huge sheet of ice, maybe a mile or two thick, covering all of Canada, parts of the US. So that raised all sorts of questions. When and how did they get here? You could make an argument that people had to be here even before those tracks were made. They had to get around that ice or come before the ice was there. So you'd have to add even a few more thousands of years. So Ice Age alone is about the oldest firm dating for any human occupation in the Americas, depending on who you ask. You can ask 10 archaeologists this question, and I guarantee you're going to get probably 15 different answers. But that's what raised a lot of questions, perfectly good questions, about the dating. Are those tracks really that old? Well, there was another issue. There's nothing published on this, but it just sort of rumbles around out there amongst some archaeologists. Are they really human tracks? Was it somebody's overzealous imagination excavating? Those sorts of questions. Could it be some other kind of animal? Well, you've seen some of the photos. I mean, you got a heel and an instep and 5 toes. Well, now, giant ground sloth tracks have been confused for human tracks. There's a literature on that because they're about the right size and shape except for the toes. So it's not a bad question. You know, we have to make, or the track people have to make the case that these are human tracks. Now, the whole issue of whether it's just maybe some mammoth tracks and excavation crew was enhancing them or something like that. There was a really interesting part of the story that hasn't gotten enough attention, I don't think. Right here, these are not imprints. Those are molds. The older deposits down here, they've been cemented with dolomite, which is kind of like lime. And they can't trowel it. And so down deep, what they did was they would cut on either side. And then down here, they would take a chisel, a big chisel, and put it against the layers, the individual beds, and hit it with a hammer, and it would fracture across the bedding planes. And every now and then, that's what popped up. You would have the negative and positive image of a track. That's about as good a context as you're ever going to get, and absolutely no question about, are these really human tracks? And one of the dumbest things I ever did do, I was out there one day when one of those came up, and I didn't take a picture. But in part because to me it wasn't an issue. It was like, of course these are human tracks. But anyway, that's not a big issue. And nobody's really published any critique of the tracks, although I wouldn't be surprised if something's in the mill. And you can see here on the diagram, those are the tracks that were excavated, not the ones in the trench, but they were TH4 right here is the original discovery tracks, and then they could trace those underneath the others. And it's pretty clear that you've got people walking around. That's what it looks like. You guys have been on the beach. It's just like what you expect to see. So I don't think that's an issue. Now, the bigger issue is the carbon-14 dating. So a real quick primer on this is in the atmosphere, nitrogen atoms get hit by cosmic rays. And when that happens, the carbon or the nitrogen-14, you add a neutron and you have carbon-14, okay? And it is an unstable isotope. Now the carbon-14, it is made and it decays in the atmosphere, made and decays, but it's a more or less constant rate. And it gets into all living things. We all have carbon-14 in us, and we also have carbon-12, and we have carbon-13 in us. And once a living organism dies, the carbon-14 starts to decay, but no more is coming in. As long as we're respiring, we always have a constant ratio of C13, C12, and C14. So the concept, or the basic idea behind carbon-14 dating is looking at the ratio of the carbon-14 to the carbon-12, knowing the decay rate, the half-life. That's the basic principle, is measuring carbon in from something that was once alive. So what we've been dating out there includes the Rapia seeds I mentioned. The Rapia there was quite a bit of criticism. And so people said, hey, you need to date something like polygrains. So they dated the polygrains, and there was more criticism. And then that sort of just stopped. There was back and forth. Well, I had an opportunity to go farther. Now, context is key in all of this. The critical issue is finding carbon that is associated with the event you're looking for, okay? And so rupia seeds, for example, they can take up old carbon from groundwater, like from limestone, carbon that's thousands or tens of thousands of years old. And if that rupia seed is taking up that old carbon, you're going to get a really old date that is not a true date. It's falsely old. So the argument was, well, there's maybe groundwater. They're living in groundwater that's got old carbon. And so you're looking at rupia that's not that old. Pollen. They dated pollen, and the thinking there was, well, maybe there was some old pollen, some 23,000-year-old pollen laying on the landscape that got blown in where the tracks are much later. Okay, that can happen. So it might be, the pollen might be redeposited. The rupia seeds can take up old carbon, but did they necessarily do that? Now, we also had wetland muds. I'm going to show you a slide that were forming as the lake was extant and as the tracks were being made on the stream deposits. And they should be in equilibrium with the atmosphere. Wetlands is that's very shallow water. And so that water is constantly mixing with the atmosphere. So the water reflects the atmosphere at the time. And so the dating wetlands, there are potential problems, but I think we had a good situation here. So these are rupia. You saw that photo. That's the 20,000-year-old rupia. This is modern living rupia. This is fresh. This has been dried out a little bit. These rupia are pretty fresh looking. They're not terribly weathered. One of the arguments is that there's some old rupia out there getting washed in. Well, it really didn't look like weathered rupia, but okay, that's an argument. All right, so here we go. Here's the escarpment again on the missile range. You can see the road going up. It's about 5 meters of lake beds. There's a really interesting archaic site up here, like 8,800 years old, almost unknown in the Southwest. And so we went over to look at it, and I started poking around, one of my students and I. We began to realize there are lake beds here. And you could see, from up here, you could see locality 2. It's about a mile away. So we started doing a bunch of work, trenching and coring along this escarpment to put together the lake story and see how it fit with the stream deposits, with the tracks. These are some of the wetland deposits that were exposed in the trench, and there's also some lake deposits, and there's sand, but they're all nicely stacked up. And in our 4 trenches, we got a pretty darn good sequence: 16,007, 17, 18, 19, 21, or 20, 22, 23. That doesn't happen to me very often, to be honest. It doesn't. I was astonished that the dating came out. Now, even better, we had a really good story, lake story. So this kind of garish slide is my simple illustration of where we are. So gypsum overlook, that's the archaic site here. Locality 2, about a mile to the south. Some of the beds that had tracks right here, we could trace them across that escarpment all the way over into the lake beds and dated wetland deposits and rupia seeds together. I had some other dates. I'd actually looked at some trenches before this digging in 2012 and 2018, and we already had some dates on wetland muds and rupia here. And so the dating here and all this dating over here nicely fit. We could trace the deposits more or less continuously across that mile of exposure. So to come back to the controversy, the rupia seeds can take up old carbon. Now, what was going on though, remember these tracks are on a stream bed, fresh water coming off the mountains. Okay, during the last ice age, a lot of fresh water. That's why there was a lake. because there was a lot more water available. Snow line was down several thousand feet in those mountains during the full glacial period. So there was a lot of water, and of course it was a lot colder, so you're not evaporating it as quickly. So the tracks were formed on freshwater stream deposits. The Rupia seeds were living in fresh water. They're not living off of old carbon. Now, one of the problems in the criticism is that they dated Rupia in modern spring deposits in the lake. The problem is the hydrology today isn't remotely what it was even 10,000 years ago, never mind at the height of the last glaciation. What Rupia is living in today out there has no bearing on what it was living in 20,000 years ago. And anyhow, I think that's the argument we made more recently. Now, the old pollen might be redeposited, but it's just very unlikely. Think of the odds. We have some, let's say we've got Rupia that happens to be 23,000 years old, but it's really 15,000. And then the argument is you got some pollen that happens to be 23,000 years old, that happens to get mixed with the 23,000-year-old falsely old Rupia, and that happens multiple times through in the stratigraphic section. I mean, the odds are not good. I mean, that's my argument, okay? And all of the wetland muds fit right in. So we have, between the work I did, or my students and I did, we did, and the US Geological Survey, we have 55 radiocarbon dates run in 3 different labs on 3 different sources of carbon, and they all line up. They're all, you saw the story there. So that's what we think is going on out there. So we can certainly add, as far as I'm concerned, there's no doubt we can add locality 2, the white sand story, to the pantheon of pre-Clovis sites. I think we've got a good story there. All by itself, there's nothing else like it in time. That's a whole other issue. We can talk about it if you want. Okay, well, that's the story. I certainly need to thank the people at the White Sands National Park and the Missile Range. David Bustos, he's the park environmental scientist who's driven this thing since the day I showed up, since the day I walked out there. And Matthew Bennett is the track guy. And so, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay, so the question is, what does the glacial record tell us about when ice was present and ice was not present? Yeah, that's a good question. Those ice sheets started growing, episodically about 40,000 years ago, but it wasn't until the earlier 20s that they were close to covering the whole continent. So it's actually in geologic time, let's say over the past 100,000 years, there's a relatively brief period of constant ice cover. So 50,000 years ago, certainly 100,000 years ago, it wasn't much different than it is today. There's no glacial ice. So, but you still have to get people, if you want to have no ice or limited ice to get people over here, that means they came a lot earlier. Now, some people argue that they had boats and came along the ice front. Some people even argue they came over the ice, that it's not necessarily impossible to do that. I don't know how we'll ever sort that out, but yeah, it was a few thousand years before that ice coverage was complete across the continent. There's 2 ice sheets, one in the Canadian Rockies and then the big one, and they grow and merge and come apart. So a lot of the focus is on the in-between, the so-called ice-free corridor. But there's a lot of arguments about boating too. Yeah, thanks. So the question is, basically, how did we go from a few scattered pre-Clovis sites to Clovis continent to continent? Thousands of artifacts, lots of sites. That is the question, and it's something, no, it is, so you didn't ask a snarky question. I've been thinking about this. My answer is, what this story is telling us is that people are getting over here and they're not surviving. Eventually, the populations go away. And then later on, maybe there's another group or groups that get over here, hang out for a while, don't survive. That's what the record tells me. So this is just my opinion. When you look at these sites, and there are more, I just put a half a dozen up there. There are others that are debated, and in South America too. But you could take every site that's ever been proposed as a pre-Clovis site, and you'd still have maybe a site or two per millennium. That tells me that you're just, and scattered around with no comparable artifact inventory. That tells me people are getting here in dribs and drabs and they go away. To me, one of the biggest questions is where the hell did Clovis come from? Why all of a sudden do you see this technology all over coast to coast in the US and some in Canada? And so fast, because the dating of Clovis shows they covered the landscape pretty quickly. That to me is one of the bigger issues, not whether somebody was here 20,000 years ago. It was what led to Clovis? So no, that's the question. Questions, thank you.
I have two questions for you.
Okay.
One real quick. In the logo there in the bottom right, is that the Murray Springs bone wrench
Yeah,
that I see?
shaft wrench, yeah. Yeah, that's a logo one of our former students made up for me. This ARF is the Archaeological Research Fund. All of you guys are probably, you're my generation, you remember Little Orphan Annie and the dog, Arf Arf? Well, we just modified that, and yeah, Annie's holding the bone shaft wrench. Yeah, from Murray Springs. Good eye.
Thanks. But my bigger question
easy.
though is there, so I didn't hear mention of any artifacts found in context in any of these. Is there any artifact tradition found either contemporary or at least comparable to that stratigraphic level anywhere in North America that you're aware of?
No, that's sort of what we were talking about, is there's no coherent lithic assemblage. There's some assemblage, there are a few assemblages that show up, but they don't really look like others. No, there's no artifacts out here, zero. All you have is people going from A to B, and we don't know where A is, and we don't know where B is. They're tracks. Now, I'll anticipate another related question, because this has come up before. Why aren't there any artifacts if people are walking around? There are about 60 individual footprints. So ask yourself, how long does it take to make a footprint? A second at most, right? At most, a second. And we have 60 footprints through the layers. So let's be really generous. You're looking at about 10 minutes of time. What are the odds that some hunter-gatherer is going to drop a stone tool? Now, they could have bone or wood tools that don't survive, but we're all thinking in terms of stone tools because those would survive. Drop the stone tool, and neither that person or anybody else that might have been around said, "Hey, guy, you dropped that valuable tool." To me, it's unlikely, but it's it's not surprising. I mean, do we wander around dropping tools all the time? I mean, our kids do, but we don't very often. And of course, they don't have pockets or anything, but still, it's just logically to me, you wouldn't expect to see tools you're literally looking at a couple of snapshots, a few Polaroid images in time. And no, it's a good question. What were they making? Where were they living? That was the first question I got when this story came out. It's where are the sites? Where are they living? Well, I don't know. That's one of the reasons we started doing this geologic work, to at least put together the paleo landscape story. Where might they be? They're not going to be out in the lake living. Maybe they're in wetlands hunting, but we don't have that evidence.
This may sound a little naive, but okay, there were footprints. Why aren't there any signs of a hiking stick of such aiding the person, or when they're carrying a baby, when they put the baby down, a butt print, or or some sign of a human on the ground?
besides feet?
Besides
Besides feet? Well, again, as I was pointing out, we're looking at most a few minutes. And this is just exposed in, as again, an excavation area about like this and in a trench. So not a lot of area. And those 60 or so tracks, there's one trackway that, I think there was one with 20-something tracks. Okay, I just think that the odds are just limited. I could see a walking stick, but on the other hand, it's a possibility, but I think we're seeing so little time represented that it's just the odds are we're not going to see things like that. But yeah, over time, given a big enough area, somebody's going to sit down, somebody's going to maybe have a walking stick. But yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question, but I think we just don't have the snapshot. Like a big archaeological site, you're looking at lots of time over a lot of space. And this is really a moment, literally a moment in time. I'm sorry.
Of the tracks that appeared to go like in a path, that was perhaps the same person walking, how many people do you estimate those tracks all belong to that you have found so far?
Okay, can I go back? It's not me. I'm not the track guy. No, seriously, there's a guy from Britain, Matthew Bennett. He's an ichnologist. That means trace fossils. And he's one of the world's leading authorities on tracks. And so he did all this, made this up. Okay. So there are 5 prints. So that would be one person probably. This one is 37 tracks, 37 prints made by 5 different people. 11 prints made by 2 people, just 2 tracks, don't know how many, and then 5 tracks made by 1 person. So not many people doing this, but again, the total is something like 60 tracks, all total, prints, I should say, not tracks, individual prints. They exposed a little bit more of this that hasn't been published. It wasn't a whole lot more. Probably another 15 or 20, all together. Remember, we're talking about layers with tracks. So did I answer your question? Yeah, okay, thanks.
I was really impressed by your dating work, the methodological work there.
Thanks.
But I wanted to ask, because in situations like this, my mind would go to OSL dating. Did you ever consider that, and would there be, I would assume there's not enough material there because it's gypsum sand, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question was alternate forms of dating besides carbon-14, and there's one that's called, it's OSL, optically stimulated luminescence, and what it tells you is how long has it been since that particle was last exposed to the sun. And this dating method it's usually on quartz or feldspar, and it actually works pretty well. I won't, it gets me to the limits of my geochemistry, but anyway, it works pretty well. And in fact, they did do that, and just a few, and it worked out. It is difficult because of the gypsum, except those stream beds have quartz and feldspar. Remember, those stream beds are coming off the mountains. So they did do a little OSL, but, and it worked. I can't remember, it was just a handful of dates. But the radiocarbon story works. Anyhow, and I don't know if they have plans for more. Again, I was focused on the radiocarbon. This other work was by the USGS, including the OSL, and I don't know if they have plans for that. Is that? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Are there plans to expand the project and do much greater research?
On the tracks?
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't know. I work with those people, but I'm not part of the team that plans all that because they have their priorities and I'm doing other things. I'm retired, and which is, we pulled all this together since I retired, all this dating. But I'm satisfied. I hope they do more excavations. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, though, we're talking about a national park, And that imposes its own, you don't, people, well, why don't you dig trenches and bulldoze those dunes? You can't do that in a national park. You could do it on the missile range, in theory. And I don't know if they've thought about that. That long track I talked about, the 800-meter track, it goes onto the missile range for some unknown distance. So, and I know some of the folks on the missile range have been trying to get involved, but I don't know where that is. But I hope, the big focus right now is trying to find human tracks in other ancient lake beds in the Southwest, like Wilcox Playa is an obvious one. I have seen on Google imagery, some of the park people showed me, there's a place where you could see mammoth tracks. They show up pretty well. They're really distinctive. So they're mammoth tracks. There's certainly a good place to look, and a few other places. So they're spreading out. And so in the park, I don't know. I mean, it's certainly got them a lot of attention. But yeah, you're destroying the park. This actually brings up an interesting conundrum in the park. The reason that gypsum is there is because of wind erosion, which means part of the park is blowing away, literally. And so there's discussions of, well, gosh, we need to preserve these tracks. We need to bury them. We need to limit the wind erosion. But again, that bumps up against what the park is about, is nature in action, erosion. It takes about 2 years from exposure to destruction for a track. So they're pretty delicate. But anyway, yeah, it's a really fascinating story to be part of, obviously, and learning about, these very issues, like, how much digging can you do in the park? So,
how many other animals, or did you see any other animals besides the mammoth at that area?
Right in with the track?
Yeah.
Right, in the excavations, they did find mammoth. I should have pointed it out. It was in one of those trench walls. I remember seeing a bear track. It would be in the range of a brown bear. It wasn't the big Arctodus, the extinct short-faced bear. I think directly associated with the tracks, I think mammoth's the only one, but that's just, again, in this very small exposure. Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. There is a place in the park, there's a place where a human trackway is in a giant ground sloth trackway. Now, the park people wanted to make an argument that this is hunting, right? Now, the track guy, the track expert, he was very skeptical of all of this until he spent some time out there. And when he decided that, yes, those human tracks are about the same age as the sloth tracks, and I thought, okay, because I knew this guy was really skeptical. But are we talking a minute? Somebody is like, the giant ground sloth is over there, and I'm going to walk in his tracks, or the next day? As far as we're concerned, from the perspective of thousands of years, it's instant, right? But if you're thinking of hunting, that's not hunting. That's a guy walking, following some tracks when the animal is, a day's walk away. So there is that association, and that's the first association of humans and giant ground sloths on the same landscape at the same time. But anyway, yeah, I hope they do. That'd be cool.
Our online audience has a question. A couple questions actually came in about other than megafauna, what was there to eat out there? What would people have been surviving on? Fish in the lake?
Yeah, I don't know what kind of animals live in jippy water. I'm sure there's a lot. I could imagine birds being out there. Certainly a lot of plants. Plant harvesting is probably a big part of it. Reptiles, snakes, frogs, probably be quite a menagerie.
Are there paleoethnobotanists working on to reconstruct what the plant landscape looked like out there at that time?
Not that I'm aware of, no. That needs to be done. The work on the lake, the Paleo Lake, has been intermittent over decades, and those kinds of things have yet to be done, yeah.
And then another question that came in was about, you were talking about sites and not locating sites where they were living, but they were asking about if there's been work done up closer to the mountains and up higher up on the landscape.
not looking for prints, because it's a very different system. You're on these very active alluvial fans like we have on the north side of Tucson. They're inactive now. But so you're going to have a lot of water coming down. There's a lot of erosion. There's a lot of burial. It's a very different setting than the lake and stream beds. They just slowly built up, very quiet deposition to preserve very fragile tracks. I'm sure people had to be living up there. It's just, you're in, there's the city of Alamogordo, there's some parks. Nobody has found an archaeological site that old. That's the archaeologist in the room will know, that's a difficult thing to say. I'm gonna go find a 23,000-year-old campsite outside of Alamogordo in the foothills. I mean, it's a great idea, except the odds are so remote. When I first started in archaeology, somebody told me, and I think it was true at the time, that nobody had ever found a Paleo-Indian site on purpose. Like an archaeologist saying, I'm going to go walk this river valley and I'm going to find a Folsom site. They had always been accidental. Now, I'm sure that's changed with all the contract archaeology, but it's not easy to do. But it's not a good place to preserve and expose a really old site, I guess is the simple answer. It's a good question. They had to be living out there somewhere, maybe even in some of the rock shelters up in the mountains, but nothing like that's been found.
And then I had one more,
Okay.
and that was someone had mentioned that they had seen illustrations of a woman with the child walking,
Oh, yeah,
and then
yeah.
but a volcano erupting in the background. So they were wondering, were there volcanoes erupting at that time?
I can't think of any 20. Well, I mean, there's volcano. There's some volcanic fields nearby, but I don't think any of them were erupting. The Portillo volcanic field right outside of Las Cruces is right there, but I don't think so. But it makes a good story. So. Yeah.
A good illustration.
Yeah.
Well, we
Yeah.
will wrap it up and close out tonight's talk. And we are so grateful for Vance for
Thank
coming
you.
out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's fun. Appreciate it. Thank you.